Chapter 5 is titled The Dynamic Cell. In Chapter 5, we talk about both energy and movement across the cell membrane. We begin with energy, and we ask the question, what is energy? And so, energy occurs in two basic forms, as we see on the screen. One is potential energy, which is energy in the form of stored energy, and the second is kinetic energy, the energy of motion. We can see a simple illustration of potential versus kinetic energy by looking at the picture of the man with the ball on the hillside. And so the picture on the left, of course, illustrates potential energy. The ball will roll down the hill if given the opportunity, and so there's energy that's stored in that scenario. The situation on the right is an illustration of kinetic energy. The ball has been pushed and is rolling down the hill, and so kinetic energy is of course, an energy of motion. So in biology, or in the world in general, these two forms of energy are converted back and forth, and during these conversions, some of that energy is lost as heat. What we'll notice is that in the biosphere, and we've defined the biosphere previously as every point here on Earth in which we can find living organisms, all of our energy ultimately comes from the sun. And the story, especially in biology, of energy is that energy comes from the sun and that it's transformed from one form to another as it makes its way through the biosphere, eventually completely dissipating or disappearing as heat. What we see is this, that we measure energy in the form of calories. A calorie is specifically the heat that's required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water, in other words, 1 cubic centimeter of water, 1 degree Celsius. Now, you realize that a gram is a very small unit of measurement, and if you're familiar with a syringe at all, you understand that a cubic centimeter is not much water at all. So this means that a calorie is not much energy. Interestingly, what we notice is this, that as you look at the screen and you see that there are 25 calories in the food item on the screen, in fact, that's not 25 calories, but 25,000 calories. And so we as humans would prefer to read smaller numbers that are easier for us to process and think about. And so the convention is that we list calories in terms of food in the form of kilocalories. So for every 1,000 calories on a food item, we list 1, simply because it's easier for our minds to deal with. We go down to the bottom of our slide here, and we look at the 2 energy laws. These laws are important to us in our consideration of energy in the world of biology. So the first one is the conservation of energy, the law of conservation of energy. It's also referred to as the first law of thermodynamics. This law states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. In other words, energy is never lost. It only changes form from one shape to another. The second law of thermodynamics states this, that during these energy transformations, you cannot undergo these transformations without losing some usable energy. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier. The basic idea in all of this, in other words, in our discussion in a biology class of energy, is that energy is transformed from one form to another, and eventually, as it goes through those transformations, it's lost as heat. So eventually, we have no more usable energy. That means that more energy must arrive at the Earth from the sun. And so what we notice is that energy takes this one-way trip through the Earth. It comes from the sun to plants, it's eaten by animals, and then eventually it entirely dissipates as heat. We find ourselves now at entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder in a system, how disorganized a system is. Our book provides us with this example of a tidy bedroom on the left with very little entropy, and a messy bedroom on the right with a great deal of entropy. And so the second law of thermodynamics is sometimes referred to as the law of entropy. In other words, as we undergo these energy transformations and we lose usable energy, that energy is lost because every time we undergo a transformation, there's more disorder that's associated with that energy. For instance, when you eat cereal, the sugar molecules that are found in that, say, Fruit Loops, a sugary cereal, those glucose molecules are very highly organized, and there's a great deal of energy that you can use there. However, once you consume those and you emit heat as a result of the generation of heat from your body, that heat is in a very disordered form with a very great amount of entropy. And that's the basic story. As energy makes its way through the biosphere, it becomes less and less ordered. In other words, there's more and more entropy. And so that means that there's less and less energy that can be used, because only energy in a highly ordered form can be used by living organisms. So entropy is disorder, and entropy increases as energy goes through transformations in the biosphere. We make our way now to adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is a fundamentally important concept in the world of biology. Think of it in this manner. ATP is energy currency for cells, energy currency of cells, perhaps. And it's the only form of energy that your cells can use. There are only two reasons to eat. One is to get building blocks, to grow and repair. The other reason is to get energy. But if we focus on the energy aspect of eating, all the food that you consume, all the energy in that food is transformed into ATP, and then your cells use ATP. So you can consume proteins, you can consume carbohydrates, you can consume lipids, and all those are transformed into adenosine triphosphate, fed to your cells, and that's what's keeping you alive at this particular moment. Now, the basic idea is this, that ATP is, the structure of ATP is shown, if we follow the cursor, on the lower right-hand side of our screen. We have three phosphate groups, the most important part of ATP that we want to focus on. These three phosphate groups are large, bulky groups that don't want to be bunched together. And what we notice is that this is much like the analogy of taking three large beach balls and putting a belt around them and tightening that belt more and more and more. These three phosphates are analogous to the three beach balls with the belt wrapped around them. If you took a pair of scissors and clipped the belt, then those beach balls would fly apart, releasing energy in that process. That's exactly what happens in the case of ATP. If we go over here to the left-hand side of our screen, here is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We remove a phosphate here, and as that phosphate is removed, then energy is released. And then, of course, we're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Adenosine diphosphate has little energy, and so we have to add energy to it to smash this phosphate back with the other two and regenerate ATP. And over again, this occurs in your body. This is what's sustaining life. In fact, death occurs when ATP is no longer generated and something referred to as rigor mortis sets in. Now, it's interesting to note that you're able to store certain forms of energy in your body. You store energy in the form of carbohydrates, such as glycogen. You store energy certainly in the form of lipids, such as triglycerides. But you do not store much ATP at all. At any given time, you have enough ATP on hand to last about 60 seconds. And so you're continually making ATP and then using it, making it, using it, making it, using it. And this is how you go through life. You apparently generate your weight in ATP during a 24-hour period, if you can believe that, because you simply make it, use it, make it, use it. Any given molecule of ATP is only on hand for approximately 60 seconds or so. So, to review, ATP is the energy currency for cells. There is no other form of energy that cells can use aside from ATP. Now, we can ask the question, cells use ATP, but how do they use it? And the answer is this, that cells couple reactions. The removal of a phosphate, as we see here on our slide, from ATP is obviously an energy-releasing reaction. That's the point, and what we just talked about in the previous slide. And so what the cell will do is take that energy that's released in the reaction shown on top here and use it to combine, to transform C and D into A and B, which is an energy-requiring reaction. And so by coupling these two reactions, the body is able to accomplish actually everything that happens in the body happens as a result of this coupling process. Let's look at some examples. So here's the classic, perhaps best example, and this is where a tremendous amount of ATP would be used on a daily basis. in muscle movement. And so on the screen, we see a woman curling a dumbbell. And what we notice is that we've zoomed in here and are looking at the proteins that are found in her muscle. This is actin, and this is myosin. Myosin has a very small structure referred to as a head, and that can move ever so slightly. And so it can change positions from position 1 to position 2 to position 3. Myosin reaches out, grabs onto actin, and it does so because we have taken the third phosphate from ATP and removed it. And so you can see here we have ATP and myosin in its original state. Here we have ADP, so a molecule with very little energy, and we have myosin in its what's referred to as the cocked state. It's ready to contract. Then the last step is that it does contract, and so it undergoes this ever so slight movement, sometimes described as the snapping shut of a mousetrap. And so it snaps back here in this third diagram to its original shape. And interestingly, that's how your muscles move. There is no other way that any muscles in your body move. When you blink your eyes, when you raise your hand, the reason you're able to remain sitting in your chair and not fall on the floor because your back muscles are contracting. It's all the interaction of myosin and actin, and that requires ATP for each little movement of myosin to occur. In fact, for just one muscle contraction to occur, this whole thing we see on the slide has to happen perhaps 60 times. And we're just seeing one little myosin head. There are thousands of myosin heads that are associated with each muscle in your body. And so that's a good illustration of the amount of ATP that's required for you to survive. You need large amounts of ATP, and that's, of course, why you have to continually eat. Your body's taking the energy in the food that you consume and turning it into ATP. We move now to a topic related to energy, but a little bit different than what we've talked about so far. This is one of the biggest ideas in biology, the flow of energy. It's important for us to keep in mind that energy does not cycle, but rather it flows through the biosphere. And we see that flow illustrated in this picture on the right-hand side of our screen. Now, let's follow the arrows here in the diagram. So here we see solar energy coming from the sun. A little bit of that is lost as heat, but a lot of that energy is taken up by this chloroplast. The chloroplast, as we see in our diagram, is found in leaves of plants. It's what makes plants green. And that energy, the solar energy, is transformed. We've got to follow over here on the right-hand side. The solar energy is transformed into chemical energy in the form of sugar, a carbohydrate, glucose specifically. So we go from solar energy in the plant to chemical energy, glucose. That's what plants do. They take solar energy and they make sugars out of that, and sugars are chemical energy. And they also, let's go ahead and mention this, they also make oxygen during that process. As you well realize, oxygen here in the atmosphere comes from primarily plants. Sorry about that. And we then see that the chemical energy goes to a mitochondria. And so mitochondria, as we talked about previously, are the powerhouse of the cell. Mitochondria make ATP. So what we see occurring as far as the energy goes is this, that mitochondria take the chemical energy in the form of a carbohydrate and they turn it into chemical energy in the form of ATP. ATP then is taken by, for instance, your body and used to do the work that we just talked about. Transport work, mechanical work, like in the case of the actin and myosin muscle contraction that we just mentioned, or even chemical work in the form of chemical reactions that occur in the body. So that's the basic story. This is a flow of energy. And let's review the flow. Sun to plant, solar energy from the sun to plant, chemical energy from the plant to the mitochondria, and then chemical energy from the mitochondria in the form of ATP to the cells of the body to accomplish the various types of work that need to be done in the body. Now, the only other thing to note here is this, that during the process of cellular respiration, two things are released, and those two things are carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide is needed by the plants in order to carry out photosynthesis. And so that works out nicely. The water also needed by the plants. And so that also works out nicely. But if we focus just on the energy, it's a flow of energy from the sun to plants to animals, and plants perform that essential transformation going from solar energy to chemical energy.